In today's episode, we have the privilege of sitting down with a seasoned private equity partner to explore the intricate landscape of healthcare investments. Join us as we discuss the critical role compliance leadership plays in not only ensuring regulatory adherence, but also in driving exceptional patient quality of care while fueling the growth of healthcare companies. Get ready to gain insight into the intersection of finance, healthcare, and compliance, and discover how these elements shape the future of the industry. Welcome to the Compliance Leadership Lounge. I'm Ross Ronan, your guide for insightful discussions in healthcare compliance. In our lounge, leaders and experts gather together to share their perspectives and wisdom. So grab a chair, make yourself comfortable, and join the conversation as we dive into the strategies and stories behind effective compliance leadership. Whether you're a CEO, board member, or a compliance enthusiast, you're in the right place to learn, grow, and lead with integrity. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for listening to the Compliance Leadership Lounge. Today, we have a great guest. It's Carl Zimmerman, who's a partner with Amulet Capital Partners. It's a private equity firm specializing in healthcare. He also co-leads investments in the provider market. Welcome, Carl. Sorry, I was just going to go into it already. Hey, welcome.
Thanks, Ross. Good to be with you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for being here. So Carl and I have gone back about 5 or so years now when we first got introduced to Amulet Capital Partners. Been in the trenches a little bit he had to step in and run some operational pieces of it, and I was asked to help with the compliance section of it. We fought in the trenches day by day and really enjoyed that. So that was a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you get to understand a business a lot better when you're in the day-to-day, and especially in that context, there was a lot of business building going on. Yeah, definitely a formative experience working with you and getting to see kind of how the sausage is made.
It was pre-COVID too, so we were just diving into COVID at that time before things got crazy. So tell us a little bit about how you got into private equity space and putting together portfolio companies, especially in healthcare. What's your background? Where do you come from, and how did you get into this?
Yeah, sure. My personal background, I've been doing this for about 20 years. As you mentioned, I'm a partner at Amulet, focused largely on our provider services vertical. We've made 6 platform investments in the space since 2018. Have worked closely with founders, but really building and scaling middle market businesses across different specialties in healthcare. It probably goes back to just growing up. My dad was an entrepreneur, business owner. And so from an early age, I was always interested in how businesses operated, how products were made, services were delivered, what were the incentive structures that made all that happen. So I studied business in college and ended up going into banking to start my career. Private equity was really just an interesting opportunity to be involved in that business building. It's an investing role, it's capital allocation, but it's not passive. There's really active engagement in the value creation. So that always resonated with me. Into healthcare, I was fortunate in my first job in PE. I worked at a generalist firm, but they had a vertical that was focused in healthcare, and I ended up spending the bulk of my time there. I think high level, I kind of like the idea just generally of an opportunity to do well by doing good. I think at a first principles level, I think you ask anyone in the healthcare space, and that's probably the perspective that they're coming from. I probably wasn't qualified to be a doctor, so this was probably the next best thing for me. But there's an endless number of problems to solve across healthcare. I genuinely believe that private markets are uniquely capable of doing that and addressing those issues. So it just felt like a worthwhile application of time and interest to really focus my career in that space. I think just my current role, that's really what we're trying to do. We're finding businesses, business models in markets and solving what I think are critical problems in the healthcare space. So it's fun. It's a lot of hard work, but it's rewarding. If we can do that and also make a return for our limited partners, knock on wood, we've been successful at doing so far, then it's a win-win-win.
We're so lucky and fortunate in healthcare space and in compliance to have you and Amulet Capital Partners be in the mix, because caring about patients, patient care, caring about the growth of the healthcare industry in a manner that is supportive of the patient being first is truly important. We're very lucky to have you guys engaged in this space. We work with a lot of different private equity companies across the country.
Yeah, no, look, we're going to talk about compliance, obviously. But to me, from a first principle standpoint, I think a lot of people share that same ethos. We're in this industry because it is really about patient care. It's about access to care. It's about outcomes. There's tons of problems to be solved. Compliance to me is really the guardrail to make sure we're living up to that ethos. It's a big kind of unlock or value creation opportunity that scaled organizations, I know you've worked at much larger organizations in the past, it's just different. We work with a lot of founder-based businesses, and being an entrepreneur in a highly regulated industry, when you're trained as a physician, just in that example, it's complicated. It's not something you necessarily, you focus on it because you care about what you're doing, but you focus on it more likely at an N of one or like at a small scale. So I think a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of physician entrepreneurs, they care a lot about quality, but being programmatic about it as you scale is hard. You go from managing, yourself as a, solo practitioner to managing a small group to managing a network of groups across regions or states. And the levels of complexity just compound. From our standpoint, just thinking about the private equity model, oftentimes we're stepping into a business and backing an entrepreneur that's probably taken them 5, 10, 15, 20 years to get it to a scale where it's sort of investable or an opportunity that kind of meets our criteria for making an investment. The real challenge is like, how do we take that and do that over the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years in a private equity context? I don't know what the right analogy is, but there's like machines that are built for small scale, and then there's machines that are built for large scale. I think that the scalability of that compliance function is super important, because one of the things you lose when you grow is you lose the connectivity, right? Like a physician goes from being an individual contributor. I do all my own procedures and I can personally control the quality and all that I do. And then they go to a manager of individual contributors. Then ultimately they go to a manager of individual contributors. As you get farther and farther away from what's happening on the ground, that's where it's just critical to have the systems and the culture and the training and the process in place so that the foundation stays stable as you start layering the Jenga blocks on top of it. Working with you guys, that's been a huge unlock, because compliance is a big risk. There's existential risks to investments. There's existential risks to businesses. And the incentive structures aren't always perfectly aligned either. It's a complicated ecosystem that you got to be really thoughtful about. For us, it's always been top of mind. It's a threshold risk. And so we have to make sure we're managing it appropriately, making sure that the people that we're backing, the management teams, really understand that as well. Again, knock on wood, we've veered on the right side of those tracks by design, by the things we've done. And there's probably some luck in there as well in terms of who we've worked with and those kinds of things. But yeah, look, it's critical. It's a big unlock, a real differentiator and value creation opportunity for institutional folks like private equity or larger organizations to mature those programs inside smaller businesses.
And what's really important is, I see this with private equity, I see this with you guys a lot. Maybe the bigger private equity firms don't have these kind of issues that they deal with, but you guys are dealing with kind of the mid-sized to smaller type of healthcare practices who, like you said, are maybe founder-based, maybe not founder-based, depends on really what's going on. And that founder really having to juggle between, do I run this business in a certain way, or do I actually go and provide patient care, dental care, whatever it may be, even to the highest levels of the company. When you talk about Facebook and Zuckerberg, I mean, he was still writing codes and trying to write and run the company, right? It's the same kind of concept in healthcare, probably magnified because doctors have this other perception of themselves, like they can do anything, which most of the time they can because they're saving people's lives. But in a lot of the stuff that you deal with from that perspective, you're coming into a situation where there isn't a compliance program. There isn't a compliance functionality because they've really been doing things. Doesn't mean they're not doing things compliantly, but there might not be the full-fledged structure of a compliance program. When you're looking at kind of organizations and instances, or when you're looking at an acquisition, just from a compliance perspective, what are you looking for? What are you seeing out there? Because like I said, just because you don't have a compliance program or compliance executive or leader within the organization doesn't mean they're non-compliant. It just means they quite haven't gotten to that point yet, or they don't know what to do. So how do you guys look at those situations?
Yeah, it definitely depends. In terms of the diligence, we have enough experience now to know what to look for. It's like red light, yellow light, green light. You think about which flag gets raised based on the scenario you're seeing. Certainly, it's one of the front end things we want to do. These are threshold issues. The last thing we want to do is go through all the business diligence and financial diligence and things, and then realize that there's a compliance issue. Certain specialties may be more complicated than others. That may sort of front end or back end weight where you focus on things, how you prioritize. I think it's table stakes that we're going to do, particularly in a provider business. We're going to review charts. We're going to review billing and coding. We want to do that as early as possible. I'd say constructively, getting into the claims data, understanding what the charting looks like. It's good perspective on the business. You understand how the sausage is made and how the business model really works and how they're making money. That's super important. It doesn't always show up in the financials the way that it does when you get into the procedures and what's going on. That's an important part of it. But we also want to make sure that they're doing things the right way. As I said, incentive structures aren't always aligned depending on how a business has grown. Well-intentioned or not, there's always opportunity, or there's always risks that something gets done the wrong way, even if it's not intentional. So there's definitely a spectrum there, but it's something that we kind of front load. The other piece of this, which is related, is sort of the regulatory piece. A lot of enterprising physicians will want to try to do a lot more in terms of services. I may do procedures, but then I may want to do the imaging. I may want to do the pharmacy. I may want to do the physical therapy. I may want to do a different specialty. We try to think a lot about how is it organized and how does that look from a regulatory standpoint to make sure that we're not going to step into a situation where there could be an issue. I've learned a lot from you over the years too. These can definitely be existential risks, and there's significant look backs. And in a federal context, a lot of it's fee for service. The onus is on you to do things right. They can come back and audit you and tell you did something wrong, and then look back several years, and all of a sudden you've got a massive problem. It's definitely front and center for us in the provider world. It's a judgment call about what's solvable, what's sort of unintentional and solvable, and what's part of a 100-day plan. We're going to close on the deal. There's some issues, but we can get comfortable with it. And then we fix it early on to make sure it's not ongoing, versus what's really a threshold risk. One of the things we think about too, this varies across specialties, but we try to be thoughtful about like the healthcare value that's being delivered. If you're providing a service and it's 4 or 5 times more expensive than a comparable service next door, for whatever reason, it could be that you've got market power in some way. Those are scenarios where they can be great businesses. They can be very lucrative for the folks running them. We always try to think about, do we want to capitalize that earnings base? Where does that go over time? Do we think there's a real differentiator or quality differentiator that says, hey, we're earning these? We're not just being overpaid. We're actually earning this in some way. A couple of things that we try to think about in terms of assessments up front, like where's the risk and how do we mitigate it?
You guys are really good about doing that first. And like I said, we deal with a lot of different kind of private equity groups who sometimes have maybe even started business diligence, or they've started whatever diligence they needed to. And they're like, oh, we should check the coding and billing. Let's do that. And then the whole thing just explodes because there's this existential risk. When we're looking at this, kind of dovetails into kind of trends, especially in the compliance realm with private equity. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion on private equity over the last probably year or so related to different guidances come out, different actions being taken. How do you see emerging trends with compliance and private equity is in today's landscape versus 3 to 5 years ago?
Yeah, I'll take maybe just a different approach to give you my thoughts. We spent a lot of time in the provider space as an industry, as multi-site healthcare goes. There's been a lot of positive stories. There's been some bad outcomes or negative stories. It's definitely getting a lot of attention. There's been a flurry of activity over the last five years, maybe 10 years, but certainly getting attention. I think rightly or wrongly, private equity has come up in that context from a regulatory standpoint. But look, I mean, the reality is, as a nation, we spend a lot of money in healthcare. There's a large incentive. It's a complicated incentive structure. And so you have to have kind of the guardrails from a regulatory standpoint to make sure people are doing things the right way. We've seen plenty of examples over the years of people not doing things the right way. It's their prerogative, and rightly, I think, to protect all the reimbursement that goes on in this industry to make sure it's done the right way. I would say on the physician side, if you just look at the reimbursement trends over time for independent physicians, okay, my view is that preserving independent physicians is very important. We want to have doctors practicing independently, providing access to care, particularly in communities that don't necessarily have large health systems or large hospital in those communities. If you look at reimbursement over time for independent physicians, it's very low. It's actually been going down on an inflation-adjusted basis. If you look at the fee schedules, it's mostly Medicare data. I think the inflation over the last 20 years has been 10%, basically less than 0.5% per year rate bump for independent physicians. At the same time, costs have gone up 50 or 60% for practices. So there's actually real wage declines happening amongst independent physicians. Contrast that with hospitals and their reimbursements actually outclipping the cost inflation over long periods of time. So if you believe, as I do, that you got to have a really strong network of independent physicians across the country, there's few options for them to do. And I think consolidation is one of them. If you can consolidate, you can get operating leverage in a business and integrate in different ways to make up for some of those circumstances. I think private equity plays a big role in that. As we talked about earlier, the level of sophistication that comes, and I think compliance is a perfect example, but the level of sophistication that comes with that scale is also meaningful from a regulatory standpoint. Obviously, the target on your back grows the bigger you get. And so you have to respond to that by being, we call it like professionalizing or maturing these types of departments or these types of functions. But the positive consequence of that is that when you've got a large fragmented market, and it's really hard to regulate a lot of small individual practices, right?
For sure. Oh, yeah.
So a lot of things can be done in a way that's maybe not perfect. And when you bring that together and build and scale these functions internally, you get a lot better adherence, a lot better visibility, a lot better management of those kinds of things. So as long as everyone's doing the right thing, I would argue that the adherence to what the regulators are looking for is actually better achieved in a more scaled organization oftentimes than it might be in an individual practice or a small practice. A lot of different things going on there, but I think the trend of consolidation is going to continue. I think it has to. There's just sort of economic pressures that are going to continue to force that. I think the positive of that too is that you got resources and scale that you can invest in programs like compliance to make sure that everyone's doing things the right way. It's an unlock or a value creation opportunity as the industry consolidates over time.
This episode of the Compliance Leadership Lounge is brought to you by Ronan Healthcare Consultants. At Ronan Healthcare Consultants, we believe in transforming healthcare compliance from a checkbox attitude to a strategic advantage. With decades of expertise, our team of consultants provides innovative solutions tailored to your organization's unique needs. We don't just help you meet your standards, we elevate your business, ensuring ethical practices are at the heart of what you do. Whether you're navigating complex regulations or seeking to enhance your compliance strategy, Ronan Healthcare Consultants is your partner in achieving excellence in healthcare compliance. Ronan Healthcare Consultants, redefining compliance, empowering leadership. Visit us at www.ronanhc.com to learn more. Now back to the show. It really does start with leadership, whether it's leadership at the private equity firm, or it's leadership at the board, leadership within the company. It's a big piece to where that's going to go with it. Let's talk about leadership. I have my favorite book on leadership. What's your favorite book on leadership? How do you define that?
So I'll give you a quick funny story. So when I was in college, I had a summer job doing inside sales for an insurance brokerage. I sold commercial insurance, which I was not very good at, but it was the first time I'd ever been in that role. So I bought a couple books on sales effectiveness. And one of the ones I read was this book called How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I think it's like from the 1930s.
Those are one of the best leadership books that I've seen, are the ones from the 30s.
Timeless wisdom. It didn't work for me. I was terrible at that job. But look, it was essentially a book about human nature. It lays out strategies and approaches, thinking about how you get the most out of your interactions with other people. And in a leadership context or business context, you deal with this every day, but we have to work constructively with others to achieve whatever common goal or purpose we have. At the highest level, motivating someone in that context can come from carrots, like positive incentives, or sticks, negative incentives. This book was really focused on the carrots approach and strategies and tactics for what you can do as a leader to motivate others to get into a common cause or whatever. It's filled with maxims, and there's a lot more depth to it, but the maxim would be like, make someone feel important and they'll like you, make them feel unimportant and they'll resent you. So obvious stuff, but when it's all taken together, it makes sense. Everyone has something to teach you, and you benefit from figuring out what that is. So be a good listener, encourage people to talk about themselves, be sincere, don't criticize, condemn, complain, avoid arguments, be positive. A lot of just timeless wisdom, but I think wrapped in how do we get the most out of our interactions with people, because that's what it takes to be a good leader. Some of that's always stuck with me. Now, whether I adhere to it all the time, I refrain from commenting, but I try. So look, on the leadership side, it's critical. The difference between see this too, because as businesses evolve, the requirements of leadership similarly evolve. If you look back on businesses that have scaled rapidly, oftentimes there are different types of leaders that are the right leaders for that point in time for a company. We try to be really thoughtful about that when we recruit new leaders into our businesses. We're trying to do quite a lot in a short amount of time. We're highly indexed to who that leadership team is and how effective they can be. In our business, at least, time is probably the biggest constraint. We don't have 10 or 15 years to get to a good outcome. We've got 4, 5, 6 years. We spend a lot of time thinking about what the business needs are, what the qualifications of a leadership team are to achieve those goals, and trying to bring the right folks around the table that can be effective quickly. I think you brought up the integrity point. In the healthcare context, this is just a highly regulated, complicated space. People that have been in the trenches in healthcare organizations just have a perspective and context that's different than someone that may have worked in retail or technology or some other vertical. So that experience is very important. It's not required necessarily, but definitely valued. On the integrity point, I tell my kids, what does integrity mean? It's doing the right thing when no one's looking. How do you judge that? But it also gets back to what we talked about on the compliance programs. I think one of the big things you can do is just provide transparency. Don't allow activities to hide out in the shadows. Shine a light on everything that's going on in an organization, and then work to solve it. Because when you shine a light on it, no one wants to be doing the wrong thing, generally speaking. Just another kind of thought on how to reinforce integrity. Doing the right thing when no one's looking, but trust but verify.
Lead with integrity is about what this is about, right? You have to lead with integrity. And it's different than morality. It's different than trust. It's different than all of these things which kind of go into it. But leading with integrity is a huge piece of what we look for as compliance leaders. We want to look for CEOs and board members and even private equity groups who are going to have that communication, who are going to have that same mentality. And just to talk a little bit about transparency, I've had lots of CEOs and executives and boards and everything else in my life who have said oftentimes, I don't want to know. Don't tell me. I don't want to hear this. Just go fix it. We're not going to deal with this. We're going to keep this quiet. Hey, by the way, let's put this under attorney-client privilege so that we don't let this get out. Well, that's not what compliance does. Compliance is transparency. We're going to find it. We're going to fix it. We're going to move down this road. And if the leadership underneath that organization, especially in healthcare, is on board with that, then it all turns out great. We can make those differences. Do you do an evaluation on the leadership of an acquisition before you get there? Or do you just like, hey, by the way, we like the business model. If they're great leaders thereafter, that's great, but we're really going to evaluate what it looks like on the back end. And if so, what are those kind of essential principles you're looking for?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. The reality is, let's say, time is not our friend. So, and leadership transitions are challenging. It takes time to find the right leaders, or it can take time to find the right leaders. If you need to make a change, then it takes time for them to onboard and ramp up and get their arms around the business and be effective. In a perfect world, you don't have to do that. In a perfect world, you evaluate the teams. They've been successful in the past. You align on what the vision is going forward. And you make an assessment as to whether that's achievable or not. The management team assessments is huge in our diligence. We have used outside firms to help us with that, do some 360 reviews, talk to some of the direct reports, talk to others in the organization to get those perspectives. A lot of that's in the context of where we can be value added, like what changes can we make to make this organization more streamlined or more effective at making decisions or more effective at execution or whatever. In some situations, we'll have to bring in new leaders. And so we'll do that as well. But look, in terms of the things that we're focused on, and it really, again, it depends on the stage of the business and what the needs are. As a general rule, though, these are all on the provider side for sure. And so assessing that leadership potential, assessing the organizational management skills. If you're going to be managing 6 or 8 or 10 direct reports, how do you manage them? How do you get the most out of them or the best out of them? How do you inspire and lead them? What's your philosophy on management decision-making? I'm a gut feel kind of person. That's how I'm. Or are you very data-driven and data-focused? If that's the case, we try to understand historically how that plays out and how that applies. On the integrity side, you learn a lot about people when you into these interview processes. You start negotiating, different things. We're definitely keyed in on those elements as well. The transitions are never easy, and so we try to avoid them. But you have to do the right thing for the business, particularly when your time frame is limited. It's definitely an area we got to spend a lot of time on.
We come in and do due diligence with you guys. We spend a lot of time with, usually it's the CEO, CO, human resources, or revenue cycle, whatever it may be. We can tell pretty quickly right off the bat. We give you a call and tap you on the shoulder and go, this one you might want to think about because we've had some interesting discussions. So I think that there's a lot that plays right off the bat, especially if you're doing diligence and you're having those conversations with certain people, what their gut feel is that have dealt with probably maybe not the nicest ones in the world, or maybe ones that have maybe questionable integrity.
Right. Well, that's a good point. Selling a business is hard. And a rigorous diligence process can put people in stressful situations. You do get a look just through that process in terms of how people are going to behave and all that. So it is a window as well.
On the next level of leadership, obviously we have management leadership that we're talking about, CEOs and COOs, whatever it may be. Next level, you sit on lots of boards, and every one of the portfolio companies you deal with, you sit on that board and you guys have conversations. And then you have board of directors and that essentially guide the company and help you with overseeing things. And a lot of what you do and a lot of companies should do is have a compliance committee or have a compliance function sitting at the board. What are some of the unique challenges and considerations you look for when sitting on those boards or dealing with other board members, or how they oversee that compliance aspect so that these companies can A, stay compliant with the regulations, and B, we like to say, protect the investment that people have made in that industry so that you're not giving back a bunch of money or no one's going to jail, et cetera, et cetera.
As a best practice, and we've tried to set this up, I certainly think the board involved, this gets a little back to the transparency point, but I certainly think the board involvement is important. we're on the board together. We've got a compliance committee. We probably could have set it up earlier, frankly, but it's actually been very good because, to your point, you get that interaction with a level down from the CEO or maybe 2 levels down from the CEO. I think it's an opportunity to really set the tone and to give perspective to people that are probably in the middle of the organization in terms of what people are thinking about, and just how we talk about things is important to give them perspective and confidence in doing their jobs, to make sure that, to your point, we don't want a culture of like stick your head in the sand and ignore things. We care. We want things to be elevated. So I think having that exposure between the folks on the ground doing compliance and the folks at the board level who are steering the ship at that level is important. Things bubble up, and it gives an opportunity for the folks that are running it day to day to hear from leaders that they might not have as much exposure to understand that, hey, this is an important function. What you're doing is really important. We want to know about it. We care what you're doing. We want you to do things the right way. And if there are issues, we'll support you in solving them. I think it really sets the tone. I think if compliance is something that's pushed off to the side as like a necessary evil, that's probably not the right culture to set up in a provider organization, for sure. There's probably other examples where it's different, but definitely in our provider businesses, we want to make that important cultural point and really set the tone at a board level that we care and we want to do things the right way, and let that kind of filter down through the organization. And from a governance standpoint, I would agree. I think having that committee that has those touch points, that's more than just a couple pages in a board deck, can certainly help. Again, the thing I would say is there's always going to be issues. There's always going to be a foot fault here or someone doing something here. And in an organization with hundreds or thousands of employees, it's impossible that there's not going to be an issue. The key is you want it to bubble up early and often.
If it happens, it's when it happens, and it needs to be brought to attention immediately.
Right. The longer those things go on, the bigger the exposures become. To the point, I think the governance element's critical. I think the board involvement, setting that tone, and also piercing down a couple layers in the organization and providing that visibility, transparency, that exposure can be helpful. That's certainly what we're focused on, and I think would be a best practice for folks running these types of organizations.
We've seen in the past from either DOJ guidance that have come out or other regulatory just recommendations from a compliance perspective is really having somebody within your board that has experience in compliance. Oftentimes we see a room full of business people, strategy people. Who do you know? How are you going down this road? Every now and then, and I'd say it's probably 20%, 30% of them have somebody who's chaired a compliance committee before, or who's been involved in that, or worked at a payer, or worked at a place as a compliance officer or something. I report to probably 10 or 15 boards at one point in time, just in our compliance officer world here, what we do. And I know exactly when it's, okay, this company has set up their committee. They have a board level compliance individual who is spearheading down this culture of compliance, this culture of integrity. They're pushing it down through the CEO. They're pushing it down from the board standpoint. And it makes a nice little concise, for lack of a better word, board construction where you don't have to worry about those compliance unique situations where someone goes, I've done that before, or they don't have to go hire someone to say, hey, advise me on that.
Yeah. No, it's a great point on the board we're on. Certainly. I think it's also geared towards the specialty you're in. Obviously, if you've got significant Medicare or Medicaid exposure, I would agree. You're absolutely right. Some of these things are just not just sort of obvious things. I think having someone with that experience can be beneficial on both sides to say, hey, this is a real issue or it's not a real issue, or I've seen this before, here's what we can do about it. So I do think that leadership component is important, and having someone that's been involved at that level in the past can certainly be value added. And to the point as well, it depends on the stage of the company, but there is sort of there's a mentorship element, just a way of thinking about things, understanding like you're going to get all kinds of signal and all kinds of noise in these organizations, and being able to separate those two things and say, no, these are the real issues is important. I would also agree with you too. People have different backgrounds and experiences, right? Some people are great operators. Some people are great, strategic leaders. Some people are great, compliance leaders. It's not necessarily that everybody's got all those types of experiences. Having someone in that role is certainly beneficial. To your point, you sleep better at night when you've got a system and a process and a governance structure in place that's set up to bubble these issues up early on so you can mitigate or resolve them or whatever. So
It's our slogan, right? Coffee, not compliance, should be the only thing keeping you up at night. So that's exactly where we go with that. I talk a lot about, and I mentor compliance executives and compliance officers to be compliance executives, which that's a whole nother story, a whole nother topic for another day. But part of what I talk to them about is how does the compliance function? How does the compliance leadership? How does the compliance officer? How does the compliance executive align with the strategic goals of a healthcare organization? We always say, be the strategic partner. Don't be the road bump in the way. Set your guardrails and help this organization achieve whatever they want to achieve: quality patient care, growth, all of the things that are associated with good healthcare. Any strategies that you can share with having compliance and being side by side with CEOs, other than obviously leadership or the board encouragement and private equity encouragement? What other kind of strategies do you think that would be helpful to help those people become more strategic to the organization?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'll maybe just play it back as I think about it. If you create an antagonistic relationship between compliance and operations or the C-suite, you create a dynamic where the people that are trying to build and grow the business are thinking about how to get around compliance rather than work with compliance. That's a bad setup. It's a really bad setup. And I think you made the point, but you want to find business partners in compliance that say, I understand the mission of the business. I understand the vision for the company. How can we support that and do it the right way so that compliance does not become just like the place you go to get told no? It becomes a thought partner in saying, hey, we're trying to do something different here. We're trying to do something new here. We're trying to do more of something that we've already been doing. And it's sort of like, well, here's the framework to do that. We can do it in a compliant way. We don't run into problems. We don't get caught in any traps. Strategy wise, there's a cultural element to it. I think who you have leading the business matters a lot because the tone gets set at the board and the tone gets set at the CEO level. And then I think it's about hiring. You got to hire compliance leaders that have the perspective where you're not going to compromise. There's a right and a wrong, and where there's a gray area, there's a judgment decision that gets made as to where you fall on it. But there's a way of approaching it that's more complementary or supportive than it is antagonistic. I think you got to find that balance. You've probably seen it more than I have, but you can get all flavors of people. And it's not just compliance. And we see it like in HR and other sort of I'll call them like administrative functions. But for compliance in particular, it's often thought of as like a cost center or a place where we're just getting no's, because it's always easier to say no for anything that's going to. But if you can get the right leadership that's more oriented around the mission and the vision and what you're trying to achieve, that's obviously the place you want to be. At the board level, the hard part's probably determining what you've got, because it may not always be obvious. So I know this is another kind of visibility point, but having the compliance committee just gives you much more visibility and exposure to what's going on day to day, because you can see the interactions, you can talk to the people, and it either gives you comfort or not, but you know what you got to do, you know what the problems are to get in there. So that's what I would say. I don't know if that's necessarily advice, but.
Oh, no, it's great. It's great advice. I think everybody listening who's an aspiring compliance officer, want to be a compliance executive and work at the highest levels of healthcare and private equity and the board should really take that under advisement and how they do those things. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. If we just go back to first principles, I think most people get into healthcare because they want to do well by doing good, right? And I think most on the provider side, most missions are pretty inspiring. We're addressing or solving or curing some disease or ailment for patients. And the growth mindset's good. If we can grow, it means there's patients that otherwise wouldn't get care. And so there can be a very virtuous approach to all this. Compliance has to play a key role, but if the business isn't doing well and you're not fulfilling your mission, then the promise of all of that is limited or you're capped in some way. So I think it's just finding that balance. It's building the infrastructure, building the processes that matter to make sure you can do things in a compliant way. There's just a balance there. You got to make sure it's in support of the mission and the vision and all that at the same time.
That's great advice. We'll take that one, and hopefully people learn from that and take that to the bank for sure. Last question I have for today. What do you do to take care of yourself? As we always say, health is wealth. What do you do to take care of yourself?
Yeah, Ross, I've been on a 20-year change in metabolism since being very active and athletic early in my life. I've got 3 kids. So, at this stage in my life, most of my weekends and activities are built around them, and they're all now getting into sports and stuff. I try to stay very active just to keep up with them. I try to keep a regular workout schedule, try to get the right amount of sleep so you can just maintain energy and focus and be effective in business, but also with the family life. If I get an opportunity, golf is probably my favorite pastime as a personal activity. That's what I enjoy doing. I tell my wife if I can get my kids to play golf, then I've got to force them every weekend, but they're not quite there yet.
Soon to come. Do you have the Aura Ring? Do you use the Aura Ring at all to track your sleep?
I have an Apple Watch.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, those are good ways to take care of yourself. I appreciate you sharing that. We do feel like anybody who's in business should be a business athlete. And that encompasses not only just being experts in their field that they're in, but they're also taking care of themselves, because if you don't take care of yourself, the rest of it just goes away. So I appreciate you sharing that.
All right, Ross. Well, hey, thank you very much. This was great.
Yeah, thanks for coming on today, Carl. I really appreciate it. You've been very insightful about everything. And everybody who's listening, please, if you enjoyed the podcast, share it, pass it along, make comments to it. We'd love to hear any additional information that you want to share. If there's any great insight that you have from this podcast, love to hear it. So we appreciate everybody listening. And Carl, thank you for showing up today and spending some time with us.
Great. Thanks, Ross.
Thanks. Thank you for spending your time with us in the Compliance Leadership Lounge. I'm Ross Ronan, and it's been an honor to host today's insightful discussion. If you've enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your network. Your engagement helps us continue to bring in-depth and influential content in the world of healthcare compliance. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we further explore the leadership dynamics in compliance. Until then, remember, effective compliance is about leading with integrity, and leadership is about making a difference.